Okay, well, I'm Rick Johnson. I'm a kidney specialist, and I have a little story to tell you. It's a climate story, but it's even something more. And so, as a kidney doctor, the most common disease I see is diabetic kidney disease. It makes up about 40% of the people who end up with end-stage kidney disease. It's a major problem worldwide. And there's a link to climate that I'm going to tell you about today. So it's pretty indirect, but it's real. So here's the first slide. You know, when it comes to diabetic kidney disease, we know that it's related to obesity in many situations because obesity, which is epidemic, is associated with metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome is associated with the development of diabetes, hypertension, and a lot of other things that can lead to cardiac disease and strokes and kidney disease. And so part of the problem of this world's, a lot of the health diseases of today, or the diseases that are affecting us today, are related to obesity and metabolic syndrome. So a lot of work, which I'm just going to allude to, has really linked those diseases with sugar intake. And sugar intake has increased dramatically over the last few centuries. In 1700, the average intake was 4 pounds of sugar a year in Europe and the US. And today it's over 150 pounds of sugar per capita per year. In fact, added sugars like high fructose corn syrup and table sugar make up about 15% of our diet. And there are groups, the disadvantaged populations, indigenous populations, children, and young adults that are eating 20% of their diet is sugar. Even some 25%. There's even cases of 30%. It's like amazing. Sugars in so many foods, processed foods, junk foods. It's high fructose corn syrup is added to something like over 75% of the foods you find in the grocery store. And with that, in the high fructose corn syrup and in the sugar is a particular sugar called fructose. And our studies have shown that fructose is unique among nutrients and triggering a biologic switch that makes you hungry, eat more than you can normally eat, induces insulin resistance, and actually induces a lot of these diseases. In fact, our work, which has been published in many top journals, has linked fructose with obesity, diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure, cancer, and even brain effects, including dementia. And when we knock out fructose metabolism, we can basically block most of these diseases. So sugar is playing a role in a lot of today's diseases. And most of us are probably going to have a dessert tonight because we are all loving sugar. So sugar, one of the main sources of sugar is sugar cane. And sugar cane, has a dark history to begin with because the rise in sugar intake was really linked with the rise in sugar cane plantations, which was very much linked with slavery and terrible, terrible things in humankind. And so there's a very dark history of sugar and sugar cane harvesting. But today I'm going to tell you about another dark side of sugarcane. And that is that sugarcane workers today are suffering from chronic kidney disease. And I don't know why the picture on the right does not light up. But basically, there's been an outbreak of kidney disease in numerous areas in the world, including Central America, especially in the Pacific coast, in Mexico, in India, in Sri Lanka, in Thailand, and I have been very actively involved in those epidemics Over 60,000 deaths, and that was 8 years ago. It's probably over 100,000 deaths. And typically the person who's involved is this young worker, often athletic. They're not obese, they're not diabetic, they are athletic. They're out there in the sugarcane fields, in the hot fields, there's no shade. And these guys get very hot and heat stressed. And our group was able to show that heat stress can cause chronic kidney disease. And we showed it in laboratory animals, and we showed that if you hydrated them adequately, you could block the development of kidney disease. And then we went on, and along with many other groups, we linked the kidney disease with heat. We had a kind of major moment when we realized that the sites where all these diseases are being reported are the hottest regions. And we had this really interesting thing where we were looking, they develop acute injury, kidney injury, when they're in the fields. And there was one time where all the workers got severe injury, and I Googled the date, and it turned out that was the hottest day of the year. And so it was these heat waves that was linked with it. And today we know this disease is one of the first epidemics from climate change. It's one of the first major epidemics of climate change related to heat stress. And there's already very good data that that hydrating and giving shade and breaks and so forth can help reduce the development of kidney disease. And in fact, studies by OSHA, the Occupational Safety Health Administration, has shown that by 10 a.m., it's so hot out there that they should only be working 15 minutes out of the hour. And yet they're working, as you know, a lot with very few breaks into the afternoons. So it's really not a very good situation for these poor people. But guess what? There's another story that I'm going to tell you about real quick. That story is that, what they do to facilitate cutting the cane is they burn the cane field. And that burns off the green leaves, and the cane, the stalks are still there, and they can machete and cut them, and that still has the syrup, the sugar cane syrup that they use to make sugar. And then it's easier to cut, and so it's cheaper for the plantation owners to burn the fields, and then they go out there and cut. And you can see that they go out there when there's lots of ash, and this ash is filled with CO2 and carbon, and turns out to be a major source of climate change in itself. And it's increasing despite all this move for climate change. The amount of sugar cane that's being cut per year internationally just keeps going up. So when we went out there and looked at this, we realized that these guys, when they cut the sugar cane, they're breathing a lot of this ash, and they're getting soot all over them. And we found that in the ash there were these particles called silica nanoparticles. And when we gave silica nanoparticles to rats, they developed this chronic kidney disease shown on the right. And then we found a way to measure the silica nanoparticles in the ash using a mass spectrometry method, where we could actually look at the pattern and get a signature for sugarcane. And we found that in the sugar, we could show that 70% of the ash contains these particles, and we could show in human kidney biopsies that those particles were present from these people. So now we have two mechanisms for kidney disease: heat stress and silica nanoparticles coming from the sugar cane. And so what we're showing is a cycle, and the cycle goes like this. When they burn the sugarcane fields, they are killing the workers because they're breathing in the sugarcane ash. Strike one. The sugarcane ash is driving climate change. Strike two. The sugarcane is now cheaper when they burn the canes, so that means there's more sugar to eat. more obesity and diabetes, strike 3. And then more diabetes means more diabetic kidney disease, which is where I started from, strike 4. You can't have 4 strikes. You're out at strike 3. These guys, so what does it tell you? We got to stop burning the sugar cane. We need to stop burning all these things like rice husks and so forth. We have to find alternative ways. And frankly, I would like to see sugar cane, the amount of sugar ingested reduced worldwide. And maybe this would be one way to do it. So that's it. That's my story. Alex.
So I'm not a physician, but I'm honored to be here with the physicians that are here. I'm actually a lemur biologist, and I spent 3 years living in a tent in Madagascar. And one of the things we realized was that lemurs in fragments, we were darting these lemurs, and we were darting lemurs in the national park, and we're trying to understand how different levels of evolutionary constraint on their behavior affected their extinction success. And worked with 12 different species of lemurs. We darted 3 species of lemurs, and we decided to look for something which was lemurs, like a lot of other animals, including humans, get malaria. And we started doing malaria blood smears in the lemurs, and what we found was the lemurs in the fragments actually had malaria, and they of these 60 plus lemurs that we had looked in these 2 study sites, in the intact forest, they did not. And that really started pushing me down a path of thinking of the relationship between biodiversity loss or misuse of nature, climate change, and disease. And that's one of the big areas we're working with. We know for the last few years that we've been dealing with this issue of COVID, and it has had tremendous consequences on malnourishment, on 150 million people moved into extreme poverty, many excess deaths that we've seen around the world, morbidity and mortality. But we still don't talk about the sources of where this pathogen is. Our attempts have been, and I love having the music backdrop, but our attempts have been we respond to disease, but we don't think of the upstream factors that give rise to the emergence of those diseases and emergence of places like wet markets in Wuhan. And COVID wasn't the exception, right? We're seeing newly emerging diseases that are being identified at 1 a year, perhaps even faster. 3/4 of emerging infectious diseases are shared between humans, wildlife, and animals. And the spread of disease, the amount of time it takes to go global, is decreasing over time, and you can see those stats there. This is kind of a critical piece. Why is that happening? And that's happening because human activities and human misuse of nature is actually selecting for the spread of these and the emergence of these diseases and the mutation of these diseases. Habitat fragment, wildlife trade, the pet trade, climate shifts, environmental pollution. And I think this is the other really critical part. Human changes of the environment for the environment is transforming many of these areas of medicine. So vaccine development, vaccines are getting less effective because of that high rate of mutation. And in fact, Omicron, and we're going to talk about that in a sec, right, was thought to be a spillback of where it went from wildlife to humans, from humans to deer and rat and other populations, mutated faster in those populations and spilled back to humans. So if we think about that, that affects the efficacy, those mutations affect the efficacy of our vaccines, our diagnostics, and we're changing distributions and pathogens and vector distributions and behaviors, and we're even changing our immunity to be able to deal with diseases because of fires and heat and food security issues and drought that are caused by climate change and other comorbidities. This is from Indonesia. This is a picture I took in Sulawesi, and this is one of those sources of how we actually spread disease through our habits of wildlife trade and bushmeat into humans were direct. There is no more intimate way for us to deal with animals than to ingest them and pass on viruses. Monkeypox, where we now mpox, we have a current distribution and outbreak that's out there. What was a pandemic was a emerging pandemic in 2003 that happened because they put a Gambian pouched rat that was being involved in the pet trade next to another species that then jumped from that species and then jumped to humans. Invasive species are now vectors for pathogens, introducing new pathogens into areas. And climate change is one that we've always known about. That the Romans knew about this because they would change their behavior to respect to malaria. We know dengue is coming into the United States, but this is the one that really scared me, having had falciparum malaria from years in Madagascar. Is the first locally acquired falciparum malaria, not Vivax. We had 2 cases in southern Florida, happened just in Maryland. Right? We know dengue is coming. We know these other diseases are coming to the areas. And they're made worse. Our immunity is undermined by things like wildfires in Canada. And this was Washington, D.C., where you could not breathe as a result of the fires. We saw Jonathan Patz talk about the 5 million, and I've seen 7 million annual deaths that people have. These are how spillover happens, is deforestation. And the best example of this was Nipah, where through deforestation and fires, we were pushing fruit bats out into newly cleared areas that were used as pig farms. And the bats were nesting on these date trees that were planted. The humans were collecting the dates, the bats were licking and eating the date sap, and then their droppings and these fruits would drop down to the pigs. That led to a distribution across all of Southeast Asia of this new emerging virus. And it also led to the killing and slaughtering of actually millions of pigs across the region, which is all food waste, right? Which, if you look at Project Drawdown, is one of the number 1 causes of climate. So we are increasing the chances for those risks. And these, I don't have time because we're moving pretty quickly to get into all of this, but these are the ways that degradation of the environment leads to spillover through multiple channels, right? Lyme disease is a great example where we're literally losing our apex predators, leads to the abundance of a species like deer that's carrying and mice that are carrying the ticks that are now spreading across humans, and we're seeing it with others. We mentioned Nipah. This is the stuff that I find really interesting. There is a substantial study by an institute called the Carey Institute for Ecosystem Services that looked at 5,000 mammals and found for COVID. And of those 5,000 mammals, they found 50% were effective vectors of COVID. 500 of them, 10% of them, were extremely effective, 90% plus in terms of their ability to spread. And when we started looking in wildlife, we found 40% of the wildlife in Maryland, in the Midwest, of deer were carriers of COVID. We found 17% of the rats in New York City subways were carriers of COVID. So if we're thinking about how we manage health and how we manage populations, we have to broaden our lens from traditional medicine to really think about how we're managing ecosystems and the systems around us, because they're part of the health that we have. And this is kind of the critical point. Our misuse of nature actually undermines planetary health. It undermines medicine. It undermines our attempt to help people. And this is really driven by our demand for sugar, our demand for protein, our demand for cooling, plastics, fibers, and materials. And when we look at 96% of the biomass of animals on their planets are humans and livestock, right? And we have essentially gutted out whole groups of species like insects. And we see this history. Cows gave us measles and TB. Pigs gave us pertussis. Ducks gave us influenza. Industrial farming, right, creates the condition for that continued selection and evolution and mutation of those pathogens and introduces them into our food. One other quick example, and Danielle probably knows these pictures because we found out he works in these regions. I'm actually going to show you. But
the EV transition, if we're not careful thinking about our climate solutions, we might actually be selecting for these factors as well, right? This is Madre de Dios. This is the southern part of Peru, a part that we both love, that's going in there. And what is happening is this is La Pampa in 3 years. When this picture was taken, it was cleared. I forgot how many miners, but I think it was something like 15,000 miners, cleared 30,000 hectares in 3 years. This is one of the most important areas. It's in the Andes Amazon complex. It's one of the most specious areas in the world. They clear it for gold, which they take out of the system by using mercury as an amalgamate. And then, so the landscape is now 1/3 ponds and contaminated with mercury. This is the number one source of mercury pollution in the world. And then when they get the gold, they then burn it with a blowtorch, which then aerosolizes that gold, that mercury into the atmosphere. And of course, the devastation. And I got to tell you, I've seen these pictures before. Until you're on the ground, you cannot believe what you're looking at. And that mercury has been found to lower immunity in the people as well, in addition to all the other issues and threats to the nervous systems. This is a really sad picture. This is tracks of a capybara to one of those ponds, and this is a jungle that was jaguars and tapirs and everything else that you imagine at its height only 3 years ago that we see this. So how do we think about this, and how do we think about medicine and what we're trying to do? And one of it is really thinking about how do you actually stop putting down the barriers between fields like food security, conservation, and medicine and health, and thinking about these things together. And one of those ways that we can do it is through better surveillance. A good friend of mine, George Dillon, has been at the CDC to set up a new weather service for pandemics. How do we actually predict what's going to happen? But you still need the weather stations. We built this device, which is a handheld molecular lab that a 6-year-old can use. You don't need to be literate to be able to use this. And we're building tests with the United States and others to actually look for Ebola, Marburg, filoviruses, right? Looking at Mpox, looking at Neep coronaviruses, looking at the suite of new infectious diseases at the point of spillover in the environment to figure out how do we actually use conservation as a way to minimize the risk that we have, to bring together those ideas of infectious disease and conservation within what we're trying to do. This allows us, this is accuracy of the best of class lab-based PCR, but with the ease of use, cost, and speed of the lateral flow antigen tests that we've all been using for what we're doing. And it's multiplexing, so we can actually put multiple tests on this device. But the fact is, it's really hard to actually build the assays. We work with to actually put the assays. You can see there's multiple wells on here. Each of those can be a different test, or you can look for different parts for COVID, we looked at different parts of the coronavirus, so that way it still maintains sensitivity and specificity with evolution. But we can't do it by ourselves, so we said, can we build an app store like the Apple iPhone has, right? Where they helped their developers last year make $1.4 trillion on that store, but could we actually get other labs working with us to translate lab-based assays to the field, to the points that we actually need to do this? And that's the idea of taking the idea from a software development kit and making a molecular development kit. But I think we need to think about planetary health and international development, not just global health, not just food security, not just conservation as silos, which is what we're doing now. And we need to think about concepts of landscape immunity. How do we actually use parks and other ways of using conservation as a tool within global health and reduce the risk of pathogen spillover? And I think this ends, the concept of preventive. My parents are both physicians. I have actually 18 aunts and uncles that are physicians. I was the great failure in the family. My dad was a medical school professor, right? I became the ecologist and the evolutionary biologist. But, so I grew up around medicine. I grew up in a hospital, and there was always talk of preventive medicine, which I appreciate. But I think we also have an idea of preventive sustainability as a part of this. Thank you very much.